I didn't know my life was about to fracture over something as simple as a spare key. Not an affair, not a secret account, not a confession whispered in the dark. A spare key, 3 weeks in Scotland, and a front door that opened onto a home I no longer recognized. When Mark and I stepped back into our apartment after the longest, most beautiful vacation we'd had in 4 years, I expected the familiar comfort of yellow walls and soft morning light. I expected the smell of our detergent on the couch. I expected my grandmother's handmade quilt folded at the foot of our bed, exactly where I had left it before we boarded that plane. Instead, I walked into a stranger's idea of elegance. White walls where warmth used to live, cold gray furniture where our mismatched memories once sat, our photos gone, our art replaced with generic landscapes that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby, and the quilt, my grandmother's quilt, the one she stitched by hand before she died, vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Mark stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his suitcase slipping from his hand. I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag and everything to do with the quiet horror of realizing someone had crossed a line you didn't even know needed guarding. It was his mother, Maggie. She'd promised she would only water our plants. Instead, she repainted our apartment, replaced every piece of furniture, donated the things that carried our history, our rug from a flea market, Mark's vinyl collection, my grandmother's quilt, to Goodwill like they were disposable clutter. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she would later demand that we pay her back for the privilege of losing our home to her control. Standing there in that unfamiliar living room, my hands shaking, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't about decor, this wasn't about taste. This was about boundaries. And the moment they were finally, violently crossed. I didn't know then that this would end in police visits, courtrooms, broken family ties, and a choice between blood and peace. I only knew that something precious had been taken from me, and that no amount of paint or money could ever replace it. And that was just the beginning. Before Scotland, before the white walls, and the hollow feeling of walking into a home that didn't feel like ours, my life was ordinary in the best way. I was 32, a paralegal at a law firm downtown, one of those jobs where your brain never really turns off. My days were deadlines, filings, calls that came in hot and urgent. I was good at it. Not because I loved the chaos, but because I liked the certainty. If you follow procedure, if you document everything, if you don't assume people will do the right thing just because they say they will, you can protect yourself. At least that's what I told myself. Mark was 34, a high school history teacher, steady, patient, the kind of man who could calmly explain the Cold War to teenagers while also coaching the debate team after school. He had this gentle seriousness about him, like he carried responsibility the way other people carried backpacks. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't petty, and when he loved you, it felt like being chosen every day without needing to ask. We'd been married long enough to fall into rhythms that made life feel safe. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Beaverton, rented, old building, slightly creaky floors, but with big windows that poured morning light into the rooms. 6 years in that place. 6 years of small moments that stacked into something that felt like home. We painted the walls ourselves when we moved in. I can still remember it. Mark in a stained t-shirt, hair pushed back with his wrist, rolling yellow paint across the living room wall, while I stood on a chair painting the edges. We argued about the shade. He worried it was too bright. I insisted it would make the room feel warm. In the end, we laughed because it was ridiculous to feel so passionate about paint, and when the last wall dried, the room looked like sunlight. Our bedroom was light blue, calm, quiet, like breathing out. We weren't design people. We didn't care about matching sets or perfect symmetry. What we cared about was meaning. Over the years, we collected our life piece by piece. A rug from a flea market we stumbled into on a random Saturday. Prints from local art fairs. Small, imperfect, but chosen by us. A bookshelf that had belonged to my grandmother, sturdy and worn like it had held stories inside the wood. Mark's vinyl collection and the record player his father had given him, one of the few tangible things Mark held onto from childhood that still made him soften when he touched it. And then there was the quilt. My grandmother made it by hand over the course of a year before she died. It wasn't just fabric, it was history stitched together. Squares from old dresses, curtains, scraps that had once lived other lives. My mother gave it to me when I got married, her hands lingering on it like she was passing me something sacred. When I wrapped myself in that quilt, it felt like being held by a woman I barely got to say goodbye to. So yes, our apartment might have looked like college students lived there, like Maggie liked to say. But it was ours. Every piece had a story. Maggie never saw stories. Mark's mother was 61, retired real estate agent, the kind of woman who had spent 30 years selling dream homes and learned to measure value in appearances. She had a large suburban house with a perfect lawn and furniture that looked like it came straight from a catalog. Everything in her home was beige, cream, gray, safe, polished. The kind of house where you feel like you might get scolded for sitting the wrong way on the couch. From the beginning, she hated our apartment. Not in a dramatic, screaming way. Maggie didn't need to raise her voice to make you feel small. She was worse than that. She did it with little comments said sweetly, like they were meant to help. "This neighborhood is so urban," she'd say, wrinkling her nose like the word tasted bitter. "Those walls are very bold. You two are adults now, you know. You don't have to live like students." She offered to buy us new furniture multiple times. Mark would always say politely, "We're happy, Mom." And Maggie would go quiet, just long enough for the air to tighten. Then she'd change the subject like she had made a note in her head. I tried. I really did. I went to dinners at her house. I complimented her cooking, listened to her stories, nodded at her opinions, even when they felt like knives wrapped in velvet. I told myself that if I stayed kind, if I stayed patient, Mark wouldn't feel torn between me and his only parent who stayed nearby. Because Mark was her only child. And 8 months before Scotland, something in Maggie's life cracked open. Braden, Mark's father, filed for divorce after 32 years. He left. He moved to Arizona. He started painting. And when Mark showed me the photos his dad sent, the paintings were bright and abstract and unapologetically alive. Like Braden was finally breathing. Mark would say quietly, "He seems lighter." Maggie did not become lighter. She became louder in the way she needed Mark. In the beginning, it was constant calls, then surprise visits, then guilt disguised as sadness. "You don't understand how lonely it is," she'd say, eyes wet, voice trembling like she was one wrong breath away from breaking. "I raised you. I gave you everything, and now, you're all I have." At first, Mark tried to be patient. He'd answer calls in the middle of grading papers. He'd agree to dinners twice a week, even when we were exhausted. But Maggie's needs didn't come with an off switch. If we mentioned going to a movie, she'd suddenly happen to be there. If we planned a weekend trip to the coast, she'd book the same hotel. If Mark gently asked for boundaries, she'd apologize, then do it again a week later. And I watched my husband, my calm, steady husband, start to tense every time his phone buzzed. Still, Scotland was supposed to be our reset. 18 months of saving. No extras, no impulse purchases, no maybe next time. Just the two of us. Castles, old streets, Highlands air, so clean it felt like it could scrub the stress right out of our lungs. 3 months before we left, Mark mentioned the trip at one of those obligatory dinners. Maggie's fork paused midair. "Scotland?" she repeated, like she was tasting the word. Then her face brightened. "Oh, I've always wanted to go." Mark smiled, polite but firm. "Yeah, we've been saving for a long time, just the two of us." There was a beat, one long, dangerous beat, before Maggie's expression shifted. "You mean, you're not inviting me?" Mark explained again, calmly, carefully, like you talk to someone holding a fragile glass. Maggie's eyes filled instantly. "So you're leaving me," she said, voice trembling. "After everything I've been through, after your father abandoned me." Mark kept his tone steady. "Mom, we love you, but we need this time, together." Maggie stood up from the table, pushed her chair back, and walked to her bedroom. We heard the door close, then the muffled sound of crying through wood. Mark knocked softly, tried to talk her down. Maggie told us to leave. The next day she called and apologized, said she understood, said she was lonely and overreacted. Mark felt relieved. I tried to feel relieved too, but something in me, some quiet paralegal part of my brain that lived on caution and paper trails, didn't fully believe her calm. Then, 2 weeks before we left, Maggie asked if we needed someone to water our plants. 3 small plants on the windowsill, low maintenance. Mark said we'd ask a neighbor. Maggie immediately said that would be inconvenient for the neighbor and offered to stop by. And Mark, tired, hopeful, still wanting to believe his mother could respect a simple boundary, handed her our spare key. I remember asking him quietly, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Mark kissed my forehead and said, "It's just for the plants," she promised. And I wanted to believe that promises were enough. I really did. The thing about boundaries is that you don't usually realize how fragile they are until someone tests them. At first, nothing seemed wrong. We left for Scotland on a Thursday morning, early flight, groggy eyes, that strange mix of exhaustion and excitement that only comes from finally doing something you've waited years for. The moment the plane lifted off, it felt like the world back home faded into something distant and manageable. For 3 weeks, our life was castles and cobblestone streets, Edinburgh mornings that smelled like rain and coffee, long hikes in the Highlands, where the wind burned our lungs in the best possible way, small villages where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and time felt slower, kinder. We didn't check our phones much. Mark kept his on airplane mode most of the time to avoid international charges. We sent Maggie one email, just a courtesy. She replied that everything was fine, plants were watered, no issues. I remember reading that email in a tiny cafe and feeling relieved. Looking back now, that's the moment that makes my stomach turn. Because while we were buying wool sweaters and taking photos in front of old stone walls, Maggie was in our apartment, alone, with a key, and a lifetime of opinions she'd been holding back. Even before Scotland, there had been warning signs. Small ones I told myself didn't mean anything on their own. Like the way Maggie would walk through our apartment during visits, touching things. Not rearranging them, exactly. Just adjusting. Straightening frames that weren't crooked. Lifting throw pillows like she was evaluating their worth. Opening drawers under the guise of curiosity. Once she picked up my grandmother's quilt and said, "This is very eclectic." I laughed it off. "It's old." She nodded, tight-lipped. "Yes, it shows." Another time, she stood in the living room and said, "You know, with the right furniture, this place could look so much more adult." Mark told her, again, that we were happy. Maggie smiled, but there was something calculating behind her eyes, like she was storing information, not accepting it. After her divorce, the behavior intensified. She started framing her opinions as concern. "I just worry about you two," she'd say. "This place doesn't reflect your potential. I don't want people thinking my son is struggling. You deserve better than this." There was always an edge to it, like our choices embarrassed her. Mark tried. God, he tried. He had conversation after conversation with her about boundaries, about calling before coming over, about not inserting herself into our plans, about respecting that our marriage was a separate unit from her grief. She would listen. She would apologize. She would cry. And then she would do it again. I started noticing how Mark changed after every interaction with her. His shoulders would stiffen. He'd go quiet. Sometimes he'd stay up later than usual, grading papers that could have waited, like he needed the distraction. Once, after she showed up unannounced at the movie theater we told her about in passing, I asked him, "Does this feel normal to you?" He rubbed his face and said, "No, but she's alone. I don't want to be cruel." That word, cruel, started showing up a lot. Any boundary we set became cruelty in Maggie's eyes. Any space we asked for became abandonment. Any independence became a personal attack. And yet, when Scotland came up again, when the trip became real, flights booked, hotels reserved, Maggie went quiet. Too quiet. She stopped calling as much. She stopped asking for dinners. She stopped showing up. Mark said, "Maybe she's finally accepting it." I didn't say what I was thinking. That withdrawal can be just as dangerous as confrontation. 2 weeks before we left, when she offered to water our plants, it felt reasonable. Responsible, even. A way for her to feel included without crossing lines. And when Mark hesitated, just a second too long, I saw the internal conflict play out on his face. He wanted peace. He wanted to believe his mother when she said, "I promise I won't touch anything else." So he handed over the key. The key sat on her palm like something earned. The night before we left, I stood in our bedroom folding clothes, smoothing my grandmother's quilt one last time. I remember pausing, my hands resting on the fabric, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in my chest. I almost said something. I almost suggested we lock certain rooms, or ask the neighbor instead, or hide the spare key. But I didn't. Because part of being an adult woman married to a man with a difficult parent is learning how to choose your battles. And I didn't want to make Mark feel like he had to choose between me and his mother, especially when he'd already been stretched thin. So I stayed quiet. I kissed him goodbye at the airport. I laughed when he got turned around in the Edinburgh train station. I leaned into his shoulder in the Highlands and told myself we were doing something good for our marriage. All the while, a woman who believed she knew better than both of us was standing in our living room, looking around and thinking, they don't know what they need, but I do. And that thought, the belief that love gives you the right to decide someone else's life, was the seed that would tear everything open. We landed back in Beaverton on a Tuesday evening, bone-tired in that hollow, aching way only long flights can give you. The return trip had been delayed, the cabin lights too bright, the air too dry. All I wanted was our bed, our blue walls, the familiar weight of the quilt at my feet. The taxi ride home blurred past streetlights and damp pavement. Mark leaned his head back against the seat, eyes closed. I rested my forehead against the window and pictured the apartment exactly as we'd left it. Plants on the windowsill, rug slightly crooked, record player waiting silently in the corner. Mark unlocked the front door. We stepped inside, and I stopped so suddenly that Mark nearly ran into my back. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what my eyes were seeing. It felt like walking into the wrong apartment on the wrong floor. The light was the same. Morning light still pooled through the big windows, but everything else had shifted into something cold and unfamiliar. The yellow walls were gone. In their place, flat, stark white. Our couch, old, soft, worn into the shape of us, was gone, replaced by a gray sectional with sharp lines and decorative pillows arranged with surgical precision. The coffee table from the thrift store was missing, swapped for a glass one that looked like it didn't want to be touched. The rug, our rug, was gone. The floor was bare, echoing under my shoes. The walls. Our art was gone. No prints from art fairs. No crooked frames we'd argued about straightening. Instead, there were black and white photographs of beaches and mountains, beautiful in the way hotels are beautiful, impersonal, forgettable. I felt my chest tighten. I walked toward the bedroom, my steps slow, cautious, like my body already knew something my mind wasn't ready to accept. The blue walls were gone, painted over in pale gray. The bed frame was still ours, but the comforter was new, white with gray stripes, stiff and unfamiliar. I stood there, staring, my breath shallow. My eyes went straight to the foot of the bed. The quilt wasn't there. I opened the closet. Nothing. I checked the dresser. Gone. I stood very still, my hands starting to shake. Back in the living room, Mark hadn't moved. He was standing in the center of the room, his suitcase still in his hand, his face completely blank, like something inside him had quietly shut down. He walked to the corner where his record player used to be. There was a small white table there now. On top of it sat a ceramic vase. Empty. The records were gone. Mark pulled out his phone and called his mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright, cheerful. "Hi, honey. What did you do to our apartment?" he asked. She laughed, light and pleased with herself. "Oh, you're home already. I redecorated. Isn't it lovely?" Mark swallowed. "Mom, we're standing in the apartment right now." There was a pause. "I wanted it to be a surprise," she said, like that explained everything. Mark asked where our furniture was. She sounded almost proud. "I donated most of it. It was old and worn. You deserve something nicer." My hands were trembling so badly I had to sit down. She kept talking. How she'd hired professional painters, bought all new furniture, spent nearly $8,000. How the place finally looked elegant and mature. Mark's voice rose. "You did this without asking us." "I thought you'd be grateful," she replied. "Honestly, it looked like college students lived there before." I took the phone from Mark before I even realized I was moving. "What about my grandmother's quilt?" I asked. There was a brief silence. "I don't recall a quilt," Maggie said. "It was on our bed," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to control it. "Oh, that," she replied dismissively. "It might have gone into one of the donation bags. It looked old and faded." My stomach dropped. "Where did you take the donations?" "Goodwill," she said. 4 days ago." I felt like the room was tilting. Mark took the phone back. He asked about his records. "Oh, I kept those," she said quickly. "I knew they were important. They're in my garage." He told her we wanted everything back. She sighed. "There's nothing to bring back, except the records." Mark told her what she'd done was wrong. She started crying. "I did this out of love," she said. "You're being ungrateful." Mark ended the call. We stood there in silence, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. I wandered through the apartment, opening drawers. Our clothes were still there, but reorganized, folded differently. Mark's shirts arranged by color. The bathroom had new towels, white. Our old ones were gone. Even the shower curtain had been replaced. It felt like someone had gone through our lives and erased the parts they didn't approve of. Mark called the landlord. His voice was tight as he explained what had happened. The landlord sounded mortified. He said Maggie had contacted him, told him the redecorating was a gift, said we'd approved it. He apologized again and again, saying he'd assumed it was cleared with us. That night we slept in the unfamiliar bed. The sheets were stiff. They smelled like fabric softener and nothing else. I stared at the ceiling, my chest aching, replaying Maggie's voice in my head. It's just an old blanket. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a violation, and it was far from over. I didn't cry that night. That surprised me. I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the pale gray ceiling, my body buzzing with exhaustion and something sharper, something like disbelief hardened into anger. Mark slept beside me in short, restless bursts, his breathing uneven, his hand twitching like he was bracing for impact even in his dreams. I kept seeing the quilt in my mind. Not the moment it was gone, but the way my grandmother's hands looked when she stitched it. How slow and careful she was, how she'd hum under her breath, the same tune every time, like the rhythm guided her needle. That quilt had outlived her, and now it was gone because someone decided it didn't match a color scheme. At some point before dawn, I sat up and pressed my palms into my eyes until I saw stars. I wasn't just grieving a thing. I was grieving the realization that someone who claimed to love us had looked at our lives and decided they knew better, that our consent didn't matter, that our memories were expendable. In the morning, Mark left early to get his records from his mother's house. I didn't go with him. I couldn't. The idea of seeing her, of hearing her explain herself again, made my chest feel too tight to breathe. When he came back 2 hours later, he carried 3 cardboard boxes into the apartment and set them down carefully, like they were fragile. His face was hard in a way I'd never seen before. She tried to justify it, he said. Said the apartment was embarrassing. Said you had bad taste and she was fixing your mistakes. I closed my eyes. She said I was overreacting, he added, that this is what mothers do. We went to Goodwill that afternoon. I don't know what I was expecting. Some miracle, maybe. A folded quilt sitting neatly on a shelf, waiting for me to find it. But Goodwill doesn't work that way. They don't track individual donations. They don't hold on to items with history. We walked the aisles anyway. I found the coffee table, ours. Scuffed in the same place, the corner still chipped. We bought it back and loaded it into the car in silence. The quilt wasn't there. Neither was the rug, or the bookshelf my grandfather had built, or the prints we'd chosen together. That evening I called Maggie. I asked her, calmly, carefully, if she remembered seeing a handmade quilt. She said she vaguely recalled something like that. I asked if she understood what she'd thrown away. She laughed softly and said, "It was just an old blanket. You can buy a new one." Something in me went very still. I told her it was irreplaceable. She said I was being dramatic. I hung up. The next day, Mark changed the locks. He didn't tell Maggie. He didn't ask her for the spare key. He called a locksmith and had new locks installed. He said he didn't trust that she hadn't made copies. Watching him stand there, arms crossed, supervising the locksmith, I realized how deeply this had cut him too. This wasn't just about me. This was his mother telling him that his choices weren't good enough, that his life needed fixing. Maggie started calling multiple times a day. Mark stopped answering. She left voicemails accusing us of cruelty, of ingratitude. She said the money she spent was a gift and that we owed her gratitude for improving our home. When Mark blocked her number, she escalated. She showed up at the apartment. The first time she knocked for 20 minutes. We sat on the couch, our new borrowed couch, holding hands, listening to the sound of her fists against the door. The second time she came back louder. The third time, Mark called the police. An officer came and told Maggie she needed to leave. She cried, told him her son was inside. The officer explained that Mark was an adult and didn't want to see her. She left. 2 days later, she called Mark's school. She told the principal there was a family emergency. The principal gave her Mark's classroom number. She called during his third period class and started yelling at him through the phone. Mark hung up. That night, he came home pale and furious. He reported the call to the principal, who apologized profusely. For 2 weeks, we lived in limbo. We couldn't afford to replace everything at once. The gray furniture stayed, unwanted but necessary. The apartment felt wrong. We avoided the living room. We ate at the kitchen table or on the bed. We didn't talk much, not because we didn't care, but because there was nothing left to explain. And underneath it all, something else was shifting. I could feel it. This wasn't just about reacting anymore. This was about deciding how far we were willing to let someone go in the name of family. If the first weeks after we came home felt like shock, the weeks that followed felt like war by attrition. Maggie didn't stop just because we stopped engaging. She shifted tactics. Blocked calls turned into new numbers. Voicemails turned into handwritten notes slipped under our door. When we didn't respond to those, she escalated from emotional manipulation to entitlement, showing up whenever she felt like it, convinced that persistence would eventually wear us down. The apartment became a place of constant vigilance. Every knock made my shoulders tense. Every unfamiliar sound in the hallway made Mark pause mid-sentence. We stopped playing music in the evenings. We stopped laughing loudly. It was like we were subconsciously trying not to draw attention to ourselves, even though we'd done nothing wrong. Mark started staying late at school. I started working longer hours downtown. Not because we needed to, but because home didn't feel safe anymore. And then came the day Maggie forced her way inside. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sky was low and gray, the kind of day that already felt heavy before anything went wrong. We'd begun slowly reclaiming the space, replacing things piece by piece, carefully, within our limited budget. A friend had sold us her old blue couch. It sagged a little in the middle, but it was comfortable. We found a bookshelf at an estate sale and hung new prints we'd bought from a local artist market. The walls were still white. We couldn't afford to repaint yet, but the apartment was starting to feel less like a showroom and more like a place someone actually lived. The building's call box buzzed. Our neighbor had let Maggie in, thinking she had a legitimate reason. She knocked on our door for 15 minutes straight. We heard her. Every knock echoed through my chest like a warning bell. Mark paced the living room, jaw clenched, fists opening and closing at his sides. Then she started yelling, "You can't punish me for caring. This is what mothers do. You don't get to be angry." Finally, Mark opened the door. She pushed past him without asking. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room with open judgment. Her mouth tightened when she saw the blue couch. "Why would you buy something so cheap-looking?" she asked. "That looks like it belongs on the curb." Mark told her to leave. She ignored him, walked to the couch, and sat down. "I'm not leaving until we talk this through like adults," she said calmly. "You've been ignoring me for over a month. That's childish." Something in me snapped. Not explosively, not loudly, but cleanly. I told her she had 30 seconds to leave or I would call the police. She laughed. "You wouldn't call the police on family." I pulled out my phone and dialed. When the operator answered and I gave our address, Maggie stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Her face changed, shock flashing into fury. She left without another word. The police arrived 10 minutes later. We explained everything. We showed them the blocked calls, the previous reports, the messages. They listened quietly, taking notes. They told us we could file for a restraining order if she continued. After that, Maggie went silent. For exactly 3 days. Then her letter arrived. 6 pages. She detailed everything she believed she'd done right as a mother. How much she'd sacrificed. How ungrateful Mark was. How I had turned him against her. How Braden leaving had destroyed her life and how her son was all she had left. At the end, she attached an itemized list. Every piece of furniture, every can of paint, every service. Total $7,943. At the bottom, she wrote that since we clearly didn't appreciate her gift, she expected to be repaid. Mark's response was 1 page. He told her he would not pay her back. He told her she had violated our privacy and trust. He told her the relationship was over unless she could genuinely apologize and understand what she'd done wrong. He mailed it the same day. 2 weeks later, Maggie called from a different number. She asked if he'd reconsidered. He said no. She said that was theft. She said she'd take us to small claims court. Mark told her to do whatever she wanted. That was the moment I felt it, the shift inside me. This wasn't about surviving her behavior anymore. This was about standing firm, even if it meant watching a family relationship collapse under the weight of its own entitlement. And the worst part? I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done. The quiet after Maggie threatened court was the heaviest silence I'd ever lived inside. No knocking, no calls, no letters. Just the absence of noise and the weight of everything that had already been done. At night, the apartment felt too big and too empty at the same time. We'd replaced enough furniture to function, but not enough to feel settled. The white walls reflected light in a way that made everything feel exposed, unfinished, like we were living in someone else's temporary space. I started dreaming about the quilt. In my dreams, it was always just out of reach, folded on a shelf, draped over a chair, hanging in a Goodwill aisle I could never quite get to before someone else grabbed it. I'd wake up with my heart racing, my hands clenched, the loss hitting me fresh all over again. During the day, I kept myself together. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at coworkers who had no idea my personal life felt like it had been gutted and rearranged by someone else's will. But in the evenings, when Mark and I sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the silence stretched. We weren't fighting. That was almost worse. Mark didn't talk about his mother at all. Not in anger, not in sadness. He just removed her from his vocabulary. If her name came up on the news, or in a story someone told, his jaw tightened and his eyes went distant, like he'd mentally stepped out of the room. One night, I found him standing in the living room, staring at the blank space on the wall where his records used to be. "I don't know how to grieve this," he said quietly. "She's not dead, but she's gone." I didn't know what to say, because I felt it too, not just grief for the quilt, but grief for the version of family I thought we had. The version where boundaries didn't have to be defended with locks and police reports, where love didn't come with invoices and lawsuits. The night before we received the court paperwork, I broke. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, folding laundry, when I pulled one of my sweaters from the pile and remembered how my grandmother used to sit beside me when I was cold, tucking that quilt tighter around my shoulders. The thought hit me so suddenly I couldn't breathe. I slid down onto the floor and cried, not quietly, not politely. I cried the way you do when something is truly gone and there's no one left to negotiate with. Mark knelt beside me, his arms wrapping around my shoulders. I could feel his chest shaking too. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I should have known. I shouldn't have given her the key." I shook my head against him. "This isn't your fault," I said, even though part of me wanted someone to blame. "She chose this." But that didn't stop the doubt from creeping in during the quiet hours. Should we have handled it differently? Should we have given in, just a little, to keep the peace? Was the quilt, was any of this worth losing a parent over? The court paperwork arrived 2 days later. Seeing Maggie's name at the top of an official document made everything feel surreal. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was willing to drag us into a courtroom, to put our private pain on public display, all to force us into validating her actions. That night, I lay awake listening to Mark's breathing, wondering how far this would go. I felt small, tired, stripped down to raw nerves and stubborn resolve. This was the lowest point, not because we were losing, but because we didn't know yet if standing our ground would cost us more than we could afford emotionally. And for the first time since all of this began, I was afraid. Not of Maggie, not of court, but of what this might permanently change inside my husband, inside us. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a perfectly timed speech. It came with paperwork. After the initial shock wore off, something steady took its place, something quieter, sharper. I was a paralegal. I lived in details, in records, in timelines, in what could be proven versus what could be claimed. If Maggie wanted this to be about legality, then legality was exactly where we would meet her. Mark reached out to a lawyer friend who occasionally did pro bono work. When we explained everything, every call, every visit, every donated item, he listened without interrupting. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that felt like oxygen after weeks of suffocation. "Her case is weak." He explained it calmly. There was no written agreement, no proof we'd requested the work, no permission to redecorate beyond watering plants. Entering someone's home and making major changes without consent wasn't a gift. It was overreach. For the first time in weeks, I felt my shoulders drop. We gathered evidence methodically. Printed texts and emails where Mark explicitly said the key was for the plants only. The letter Maggie sent demanding repayment. A statement from our landlord confirming we never approved painting or changes. Photos of the apartment before Scotland. Yellow walls, blue bedroom, our furniture. Photos of what we came home to. White walls, gray furniture, erased history. I watched Mark as we prepared everything. He moved with a calm I hadn't seen since before Scotland. This wasn't about fighting his mother anymore. This was about protecting his marriage, his home, himself. The morning of the court date, we took the day off work. We dressed simply, no drama, no statements to make. Maggie arrived with a binder. Receipts, paint swatches, fabric samples. She wore a navy suit and had her hair professionally done, like she was stepping into a real estate closing instead of a courtroom. She didn't look at us. The hearing lasted an hour. Maggie went first. She framed herself as a mother trying to help her son and daughter-in-law. She said our apartment was run down. She said we'd asked her to water the plants, and she noticed how poor the condition was. She said she spent her retirement savings to give us a beautiful home. She said we rejected her generosity out of spite after her divorce. The judge asked if she had written proof that we'd requested the work. Maggie said no. The judge asked if she had explicit permission to enter the apartment for anything beyond watering plants. Maggie said we'd given her a key. The judge repeated the question. Maggie said she assumed our trust meant approval. Mark spoke next. His voice was steady. He showed the texts, the photos. He explained the donated items, his records, my grandmother's quilt. He explained how violated it felt to come home to a place stripped of consent. Then the judge looked at me. I explained the quilt. I explained that it was handmade by my grandmother, irreplaceable, never meant to be thrown away. I explained that Maggie never asked what it was or what it meant. She made a decision for us. The judge reviewed everything in silence. When she returned, her decision was clear. Maggie's claim was denied. Entering someone's home and making major changes without permission was not a gift. Receipts did not equal consent. Family did not override boundaries. Maggie stood up and protested, said the judge was wrong, said she was the victim. The judge told her to sit down. Maggie gathered her binder and left without looking at us. We walked out together, sat in the car for a while, said very little. On the drive home, Mark reached for my hand and squeezed it once. Firm, grounding. That was the moment I knew. No matter what came next, we had crossed the hardest part. We had chosen ourselves. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet at first, then louder, then finally distant enough that we could breathe again. A week after the court hearing, Maggie sent one last letter. She wrote that the judge was wrong, that we had humiliated her, that we had destroyed her reputation, and that the entire family would hear about what we'd done. She said we would regret treating her this way. She ended by declaring she was done trying to have a relationship with us, and that if we ever needed her, we shouldn't bother reaching out. Mark read the letter once. Then he folded it in half and dropped it into the trash. I'm done, he said, not angrily, just finished. Some of Mark's relatives reached out after word spread about the court case. Most of them sided with us. His aunt admitted Maggie had always been controlling. A cousin said none of this surprised him. A few people urged forgiveness, repeating the familiar phrase, "She's still your mother," like that alone could erase everything that had happened. Mark didn't respond. And for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him choose silence over obligation. Life slowly reassembled itself. We repainted the living room 2 weeks later, yellow again. Not the exact same shade, but close enough that when the light hit it in the morning, the room felt warm instead of sterile. We painted the bedroom blue too. 2 coats, a full weekend. Our hands ached, and our clothes smelled like paint for days. The apartment felt like ours again. I went back to Goodwill 4 more times over the next month. I walked the aisles, scanning shelves out of habit more than hope. I never found the quilt. I called my mother and finally told her what happened. She listened quietly, then said my grandmother would have understood, that the quilt was just fabric and thread, and the memories mattered more. I knew she was trying to help, but grief doesn't listen to reason. Mark changed in small but noticeable ways. He laughed more. He stopped flinching when his phone rang. He threw away the framed photo of him and Maggie that had sat on his desk at school for years. When I asked if he thought he'd ever speak to her again, he said he didn't know. Maybe someday, but not now. We talked about moving, looked at a few places. Everything was more expensive. In the end, we stayed, not because it was easy, but because we didn't want to feel like we were running away. This was our home, until it wasn't. A month later, we found a small 2-bedroom house on the east side of town. It had a backyard. The rent was higher, but manageable. It needed work, but it was solid. Most importantly, Maggie had never been there. We packed quietly over 3 weeks, hired a small moving company, left no forwarding address. The new house felt like a fresh inhale. Mark's father, Braden, visited from Arizona a few weeks later. He brought 3 of his paintings as a housewarming gift. Bright, abstract, full of color. Mark and Braden built shelves in the garage together, working in comfortable silence. On the last day, Braden told Mark he was proud of how he'd handled everything. Mark just nodded. 5 months passed. Maggie never contacted us again. We got a dog from this shelter, Cooper, 2 years old, brown fur with white patches. He loved the backyard immediately. The house filled with life again. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something clearly for the first time. Boundaries don't destroy families. Refusing to respect them does. The house is quiet in the evenings now, but it's the good kind of quiet. Cooper usually falls asleep on the couch before the sun fully sets, his paws twitching like he's chasing something kind in his dreams. Mark sits at the kitchen table grading papers, red pen tapping softly against the wood, his shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. I make tea and stand by the back door, looking out at the small patch of grass that somehow feels bigger than any room we've ever lived in. This place isn't perfect. The kitchen cabinets are old. The bathroom tiles are cracked in places. The paint isn't professionally done. But every choice inside these walls belongs to us. No one has a spare key. No one can walk in and decide what stays and what goes. That matters more than I ever understood before. I still think about the quilt sometimes. I wish I had it. I wish I could fold it over the back of the couch or pull it up around my shoulders on cold nights. But I've stopped searching for it. I have photos. I have memories. And I have the quiet understanding that what was taken from me wasn't just fabric. It was a lesson, delivered brutally, but clearly. Love without respect is not love. Family does not mean access. It does not mean control. It does not mean rewriting someone else's life because you think you know better. Mark is lighter now. He laughs more easily. He doesn't tense when his phone rings. He doesn't scan rooms like he's bracing for confrontation. When we talk about the future, his voice is hopeful again. We're saving for another trip, maybe Ireland next year. We talk about paint colors, about where to hang Braden's paintings, about building a life that feels intentional instead of inherited. This experience taught us something painful but necessary. Some relationships can't be saved without losing yourself. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose peace over blood, boundaries over guilt, and a quiet, honest life over someone else's idea of what your life should look like. Tonight, everything is exactly as it should be, and that's enough.